Now that we've worked with objects, it's time to work with files. The commands in the file namespace, as you might expect, allow us to work with some of the files in the file cabinet. The file import and file list commands behave very similarly to their counterparts in the object namespace. So I will leave it to you to explore those commands as an exercise. We are going to take a closer look here at the file create command and the file upload command. First up, the file create command allows us to create a new SweetScript file in our project. It has no facilities for creating other types of files. Once again, this command supports an interactive mode, which will walk us through selecting the type of script to create, which folder to create it in, and which modules we want to include. I'm going to skip using interactive mode, and I'm going to try to run this command directly using its options on the command line. We know there is a path argument, just reading the help here. It must be under SweetScripts. If I look at our project structure, I have source, file cabinet, SweetScripts. Under SweetScripts, I have this SDF course folder, and I want to add a lesson 2 folder for this new script. This is a SweetHub SDF user event, and it's just a test file. There's our path. There's also a module. This is if by default we know we want to include some module dependencies in our script. We can do that here. I'll add n/record, query, and search to this script. We enclose the module name in quotes, and we separate multiple modules with a space. Now, lastly, there is this type argument option. Unfortunately, the documentation right here doesn't tell us what the values of type need to be. That would be very useful. It's not here. More unfortunately, they're also not in NetSuite Help. The only way I know how to find the right options for this type argument are to give it a wrong value and let the error message tell us. And here they are. User event script. This is disappointing, but it does work. The value we're looking for is a user event script. So let's make our user event script and see what it looks like. Completed successfully. We've created this lesson 2 folder, and there is our user event script. And SDF generates a templatized user event for us. It contains all the entry points, which are empty. You can see that it generated SweetScript 2.1. There's no option to generate your files with any other SweetScript version or any other types of files. There's also no way to choose ahead of time which entry point functions get generated. SDF will always generate all entry points for the files you create. If you don't want an entry point in your file, just go ahead and delete it. Let's remove after submit from this user event. Now, in practice, I don't personally ever use this command because WebStorm, my development environment of choice, provides this functionality for me and gives me control over the templates that it uses to generate these files. If NetSuite's templates are good enough for you, this is a great command to scaffold a new script. And once we have this file ready to go in our project, we can upload that file to the file cabinet using the file upload operation. Let's do that with the user event we just created. If we glance at our file cabinet under SDF course, there's no lesson 2 directory there yet, because we just created that with the file create command. Back in our terminal, let's inspect the help for the upload command. We see just a couple of options here: an interactive mode, as always, and a way to specify the paths directly of the files we want to upload. Interactive mode will let you browse the files in your project. We know which file we want to upload though, so we'll just specify it using paths. This should be it. We just give it the path of the file to upload. Similarly to the modules, if we wanted multiple files, we would separate them with a space and close them in double quotes. We let the command run. And then we go refresh our file cabinet. There is our lesson 2 folder and our test user event. Pop this open. Here's our empty before load and before submit entry points. Note that you don't have to run this command for any new files that you create. When you next deploy, any new files will be created in exactly the same way by the deployment as if you had run file upload. We're getting there, I promise. Now we're on to perhaps the second most significant SDF command, which is project validate, second only to project deploy. The validate operation's job is to make sure our project is deployable before we actually try to deploy it. We don't want deployments to fail partway through because that leaves the objects and the files in an indeterminate state. We're not necessarily sure which ones were updated, which ones were not, and this may cause significant behavior problems within the target account that we need to resolve very quickly. The validation operations helps us reduce this risk of partial deployments by detecting failures ahead of time before we encounter them during deployment. In order to look at what that validation entails, let's first look at the options available to us. As usual, we do have an interactive mode, but everything else here is a little bit unique. There's this -A apply install prefs, but that is only relevant to Suite apps, so we're going to skip that. There's also a log option that enables us to actually write the output of the validation command to a file in case we want to store that output for reviewing later. This can be a really useful option for troubleshooting as well as for traceability of your deployments, as you can use those generated log files to look back at your deployment history. Now, the most important options of this command are account-specific values and server. The first option, critical to understand, is the server option. SDF provides 2 different flavors of validation: local validation and server validation, with local being the default. Unfortunately, the help documentation is extremely vague and non-specific about the differences between the 2 approaches. I would love to be able to explain to you the differences so that you could decide which is best for your projects, but I have no official source to base that on. I will link to the relevant help pages about validation to let you investigate for yourself. Maybe you'll see something I don't. But what I will tell you is that in practice, I always use server validation. Always. If we run local validation, the output we get is minimal. We do get a few errors here. Well, actually, 1 warning, 1 error. But if we instead run server validation, SDF tells us exactly what steps it takes to validate our project and whether each step succeeded or failed. We get the same warning, the same error, but we get this list of steps validating against the account, validate the manifest, validate the deploy file, validate configuration, etc. It tells us every step that it took and whether it succeeded or failed. We know here that validate objects failed. If we scroll down to our error, it failed on the custom record as well as our client script. The first error here is that we have a dependency missing from our custom record. We're missing the corresponding custom segment in this case. We need to import this custom segment with the ID cseg2. Don't forget the destination folder. This is why you use your help. We've added our custom segment. Let's try to validate again. Did we solve that problem? Here's another common error. We've added the segment correctly, but in order to use custom segments, the custom segments feature must be enabled. And how do we do that? How do we update our dependencies? We run project add dependencies. Remember that thing I said about always running add dependencies whenever you add new objects? I forgot. Don't forget. All right. Now we can see add dependencies has added both a custom role. Apparently there's a permission somewhere on one of these records, and it has added the custom segments feature as required. Now, did we resolve the initial problem? We did. The only error left is this account-specific value. There's a warning up here about a circular dependency. That means the custom segment depends on the custom record, which depends on the custom segment. That isn't always a problem. It can be, but usually it doesn't prevent any deployment failure. On to our error. Many times when representing a custom object as XML, SDF needs to specify certain values with internal IDs. This is common with things like the default value of a custom field or the selected value of a script parameter. Because the internal IDs of records can vary between accounts, for instance, between a sandbox and a production, SDF represents these internal IDs with a placeholder called account-specific value. Let's take a look at a client script. The script has a parameter on it where an employee of the month can be selected. Hooray! We can see in both the default value for the parameter, right here, as well as in the in the deployment parameter, I have selected the Salto user employee record as employee of the month. Congratulations. If we now look at the XML for the client script, we can see these placeholders in those positions, the default selection for the parameter, down in the deployment, the selection for the parameter as well. This is a signal to you, the developer, that SDF cannot necessarily determine the correct ID for the target account because it does not know the internal ID in all possible targets. So it gives up and it puts this placeholder there. If we return to the validate operation, the account-specific values option is what dictates how SDF behaves when it encounters these placeholders. By default, account-specific values is set to error. This means that if you have any of these placeholders anywhere in your project, validation will fail and the project will not deploy. That's what we were seeing in our validation output. With account-specific values set to error or not specified, you must replace every one of these placeholders with a valid internal ID for the target account before your project will successfully validate or deploy. However, that might not be your desired behavior. You may not want the actual internal IDs to be specified if you are deploying to multiple accounts where the IDs or the selected values are expected or even intended to be different. In that case, you need to set account-specific values to warning when you validate and deploy. So first, I'm going to not specify account-specific values. That means it will treat them as errors. Here is our same account-specific value error, preventing validation from succeeding. Now, we specify account-specific values as warning instead. With the warning setting, validation will output a message whenever it encounters a placeholder, but that will not cause validation or deployment to fail. Instead, when an account-specific value placeholder is encountered and deployed, SDF simply ignores setting that particular field or value. It just leaves in place whatever is already set. So in this case, it would ignore setting our script parameter, leaving Salto user selected as our employee of the month. In practice, I rarely see teams use the error setting. It requires you to be very diligent with all of your custom field definitions, custom object definitions, and to frequently refresh your sandboxes, which is often out of the team's control. Lastly, please note that the validation operation does not inspect your code. It cannot find syntax errors in your code. It cannot find bugs in your code. I'm afraid that's your job. And now, finally, it's finally here. We have created our project. We've set up our authentication. We've added new files, new objects, existing objects to our project. We've validated our project. It is finally time to deploy our SDF project with the project deploy operation. Fortunately, many of the options for deploy are exactly the same as those for validate, so we can skip right over those. During a deployment, SDF can and will run validation with these exact same options behaving the same way. If you run deploy with no other options, any files which have changed and all of your objects will be deployed to the active target account. Recall that you can select which target account is active using the account setup command. I want to use the Salto account. Let's make sure I am. I recommend you run this every time you set out to deploy to avoid deploying to the wrong account. There are two options of note in the deploy command: validate and dry run. The validate option does perhaps exactly what it sounds like, and it runs the project validate operation before it starts the deploy operation. Unfortunately, it only runs local validation and not server validation. Because of that, I don't ever use this option, even though on the surface it sounds great. Combining those two operations that you almost always want to do together into one, but it just doesn't quite meet the mark. However, this is where the dry run option comes in. When you add the dry run flag to your deploy operation, SDF runs server validation and then shows you a preview of your deployment without actually deploying anything. We can see our server validation steps when we ran the dry run. We still get our warning about the circular dependencies, and we get our error again about account-specific values because I did not specify that in the command. And if we quickly look back at the help, account-specific values is again an option for deploy. It takes the same values and behaves the same way. So we're going to specify account-specific values now as well. We want those to be warnings. We do not want SDF to overwrite our selections for those placeholders. Notice too that when it failed, it didn't do anything else. It did not move on. Now that validation succeeded, here we see again our server validation steps. They all succeeded. We see our account-specific value warnings. We see our circular dependency warning. And then we get a deployment preview. It tells us exactly what it's going to do. It's going to create the SDF course folder and the lesson 4 folder. It's going to upload this file. It's going to update all of these objects. I find this to be the most robust means of validating your project before a deployment. As such, my standard workflow for a deployment is selecting my account with account setup, validating my project with the dry run, and then deploying my project with deploy. Before we actually deploy, let's make some actual changes so that we can see them reflected in our account afterward. Let's close all of these. Open up our user event script and add a log message. We will also change the help text on the employee of the month script parameter. Objects, our can look through, find the help. And now we deploy our changes. I'm about to deploy though, so I want to make sure I'm deploying to the right account. And we can do a dry run to make sure our project is still deployable. What did I forget? Account-specific values. Okay, our project is deployable according to SDF. That's about the best we can do. So let's deploy it. Doesn't work because of account-specific values again. I hope that you're noticing some thrashing and that it's a little bit frustrating because that's what the next lesson is for. Cleared the screen, deploy our project. And it apparently has succeeded. Jump over to our file cabinet, for instance. We should see our log message has been deployed to our user event. And in our script, on the parameter definition, our help text has changed from congrats to job well done. Oh, well, you did it. You made it this far, or I hope you made it this far. That was a deep dive into the features and the major lifecycle events of an SDF project. These will be the foundation that we build upon in the next lesson when we look at how to automate these processes even further in a sensible and practical way. That thrashing and those multiple iterations of running the same commands with slightly different options, we start to eliminate that by automating a lot of these processes and eliminating the need to remember all of these steps and options. As always, be sure to visit the course's Slack channel with any questions or answers that you might have for myself or your fellow students. If you have colleagues or connections who might benefit from either this course or the SuiteHub platform, share a link with them. Thank you so much for sticking with me through all of that, and I'll catch you in the next lesson.